51. The overthrow of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna. The situation at the close of 1811 may be summarized as follows. Napoleon had the mainland of Europe in his grip. Russia and Turkey were at war on the Danube, but otherwise there was no war except in Spain, where 4 years of fighting had blocked the consolidation of French control. The continental system was working badly. Britain was hurt by it only in that, without it, British exports to Europe would have risen rapidly in these years. Well launched in the economic growth of the Industrial Revolution, Britain was amassing a vast store of national wealth that could be used to assist European governments financially against 811 Napoleon. The peoples of Europe were growing restless, dreaming increasingly of national freedom. In Germany especially, many were looking for an opportunity to rise in a war of independence. But Napoleon could be overthrown only by the destruction of his army, over which neither British wealth nor British sea power, nor the European patriots and nationalists, nor the Prussian nor the Austrian armed forces were able to prevail. All eyes turned to 447 Russia. Alexander I had long been dissatisfied with his French alliance. He had obtained from it nothing but the annexation of Finland in 1809. He received no assistance from France in his war with Ottoman Turkey, and he had to tolerate the existence of a French-oriented Poland at his very door. The articulate classes in Russia, namely the landowners and the serf owners, denounced the French alliance and demanded a resumption of open trade relations with England. An international clientele of émigrés and anti-Bonapartists, including Baron Stein, also gradually congregated at St. Petersburg, where they poured into the Tsar's ears the welcome message that Europe looked to him for its salvation. Europe in 1811. The Russian Campaign and the War of Liberation. On December 31st, 1810, Russia formally withdrew from the continental system. Anglo-Russian commercial relations were resumed. Napoleon resolved to crush the Tsar. He concentrated the Grand Army in eastern Germany and Poland, a vast force of 700,000 men, the largest European army ever assembled up to that time for a single military operation. It was an all-European host. Hardly more than a third was French. Another third was German, from German regions annexed to France, from the states of the Confederation of the Rhine, and with token forces from Prussia and Austria. And the remaining third was drawn from all other nationalities of the Grand Empire, including 90,000 Poles. Napoleon at first hoped to meet the Russians in Poland or Prussia. This time, however, they decided 812 to fight on their own ground, and they needed in any case to delay until their forces on the lower Danube could be recalled. In June 1812, Napoleon led the Grand Army into Russia. He intended a short, sharp war, such as most of his wars had been in the past, and carried with him only 3 weeks' supplies. But from the beginning, everything went wrong. It was Napoleon's principle to force a decisive battle, but the Russian army kept withdrawing toward the east. It was his principle to live on the country so as to reduce the need for supply trains. But the Russians destroyed as they retreated, and in any case, in Russia, even in the summer, it was hard to find sustenance for so many men and horses. Finally, not far from Moscow, Napoleon was able to join battle with the main Russian force at Borodino. Here again, everything miscarried. It was his principle always to outnumber the enemy at the decisive spot, but the Grand Army had left so many detachments along its line of march that at Borodino the Russians outnumbered it. It was Napoleon's principle to concentrate his artillery, but here he scattered it instead. His principle was to throw in his last reserves at the critical moment, but at Borodino, so far from home, he refused the risk of ordering the old guard into action. Napoleon won the battle, at a cost of 30,000 men, as against 50,000 lost by the Russians. But the Russian army was able to withdraw in good order. On September 14, 1812, the French emperor entered Moscow. Almost immediately, the city was destroyed by a great fire that Russian forces had probably set alight as they retreated into the countryside. Napoleon found himself camping in a ruin, with troops strewn along a vulnerable line all the way back to Poland, and with a hostile army maneuvering near at hand. Baffled, he tried to negotiate with Alexander, who refused all overtures. After 5 weeks, Not knowing what to do and fearful of remaining isolated in Moscow over the winter, Napoleon ordered a retreat. Prevented by the Russians from taking a more southerly route, the Grand Army retired by the same way it had come, but it could no longer live off the land. The cold weather set in early and was unusually severe. For a century after 1812, the retreat from Moscow remained the last word in military horror. Men froze 448,813 and starved. Horses slipped and died. Vehicles could not be moved, and equipment was abandoned. Discipline broke down toward the end. The army dissolved into a horde of starving, disoriented fugitives, speaking a babel of languages, harassed by bands of Russian irregulars, picking their way on foot over ice and snow, most of the time in the dark, for the nights are long in these latitudes in December. Of 611,000 who entered Russia, 400,000 died of battle wounds, starvation, and exposure, and 100,000 were taken prisoner. The Grand Army no longer existed. The retreat from Moscow. Now at last, all the anti-Napoleon forces rushed together. The Russians pushed westward into Central Europe. The Prussian and Austrian governments, which in 1812 had half-heartedly supplied troops for the invasion of Russia, switched over in 1813 and joined the Tsar. Throughout Germany, the patriots, often half-trained boys, marched off in the War of Liberation, though it was the professional armies of the German states that made the difference. In Spain, Wellington at last pushed rapidly forward. In June 1813, he crossed the Pyrenees into France. The British government, in 3 years from 1813 to 1815, poured £32,000 as subsidies into Europe, more than half of all the funds granted during the 22 years of the wars. An incongruous alliance of British capitalism and Eastern European agrarian feudalism, of the British Navy and the Russian Army, of Spanish clericalism and German nationalism, of divine right monarchies and newly aroused Democrats and liberals, combined at last to bring the man of destiny to the ground. Napoleon, who had left his army in Russia in December 1812 and rushed across Europe to Paris by sleigh and coach in the remarkable time of 13 days, raised a new army in France in the early months of 1813. But it was untrained and unsteady, and he himself had lost some of his genius for command. His new army was smashed in October at the Battle of Leipzig, known to the Germans as the Battle of the Nations, the greatest 800-foot battle in number of men engaged ever fought until the 20th century. The Allies drove Napoleon back upon France. But the closer they came to defeating him, the more they began to fear and distrust each other. The Battle of the Nations. The restoration of the Bourbons. The coalition already showed signs of splitting. Should the Allies, together or singly, negotiate with Napoleon? How strong should the France of the future be? What should be its new frontiers? What form of government should it have? There was no agreement on these questions. Alexander wanted to dethrone Napoleon and dictate peace in Paris, in dramatic retribution for the destruction of Moscow. He had a scheme for giving the French throne to Bernadotte, a former French marshal, now Crown Prince of Sweden, who as King of France would depend on Russian support. Metternich preferred to keep Napoleon or his son as French emperor, after clearing the French out of Central Europe, for a Bonaparte dynasty in a reduced France would be dependent on Austria. The British, with an eye on one of their main strategic concerns, declared that the French must get out of the southern Netherlands and that Napoleon must go. They held that the French might then choose their own government, but believed a restoration of the Bourbons to be the best solution. The continental monarchies in Austria, Prussia, and Russia had no concern for the Bourbons, and both Alexander and Metternich, if they could make France dependent respectively on themselves, were willing to see it remain strong even to the extent of including territories in the southern Netherlands. The British foreign minister, Viscount Castlereagh, arrived on the continent for consultations in January 1814. He held a number of strong cards. For one thing, Napoleon continued to fight, and the Allies, therefore, continued to ask for British financial aid. 815 Castlereagh skillfully used the promise of British subsidies to win acceptance of Britain's war aims. In addition, he found a common ground for agreement with Metternich, both Britain and Austria fearing the domination of Europe by Russia. Castlereagh's first great problem was to hold the alliance together, for without continental allies, the British could not defeat France. He succeeded on March 9, 1814, in getting Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain to sign the Treaty of Chaumont. Each power bound itself for 20 years to a quadruple alliance against France, and each agreed to provide 150,000 soldiers to enforce such peace terms as might be arrived at. For the first time since 1792, a solid coalition of the four great powers now existed against France. 3 weeks later, the Allies entered Paris, and on April 4th, Napoleon abdicated at Fontainebleau. The French army's retreat from Russia in 1812 shattered Napoleon's image of military invincibility and brought the anti-Napoleonic forces together for a decisive victory in the following year. This French painting portrays the misery that gave the retreat of 1812 its lasting reputation for military horror. Popper photo, Getty Images. The Quadruple Alliance 8 and 16, he was forced to this step by lack of support in France itself. 20 years before, in 1793 and 1794, France had fought off the combined powers of Europe, minus Russia. It could not and would not do so in 1814. The country cried for peace. Even the imperial marshals advised the emperor's abdication. But what was to follow him? For 25 years, the French had lived under one revolutionary or activist regime after another. Now they were divided. Some wanted a republic. Others wished to retain the empire under Napoleon's infant son. Still others desired a constitutional monarchy, and there were even those who longed for the old regime. Talleyrand stepped into the breach. The legitimate king, 450, he said, Louis XVIII, was the man who would provoke the least factionalism and opposition. The monarchical powers, likewise, had by this time concluded in favor of the Bourbons. A Bourbon king would be peaceable, under no impulse to win back the conquests of the Republican Empire. He would also, as the native and rightful king of France, need no foreign support to bolster him, so that the control of France would not arise as an issue to divide the victorious powers. The Bourbon dynasty was thus restored. Louis XVIII, ignored and disregarded for a whole generation, both by most people in France and by the governments of Europe, returned to the throne of his brother and his Bourbon forefathers. He issued a constitutional charter, partly at the insistence of the liberal czar, and partly because, having actually learned from his long exile, he sought the support of influential people in France. The Charter of 1814 made no concession to the principle of popular or national sovereignty. It was represented as the gracious gift of a theoretically absolute king. But in practice, it granted what most of the French wanted. It promised legal equality, eligibility of all to public office without regard to class, and a parliamentary government in 2 chambers. It recognized the Napoleonic law codes, the Napoleonic settlement with the church, and the redistribution of property effected during the Revolution. It carried over the abolition of all feudal privileges and manorial rights. It confined the vote, to be sure, to a very few large 807 landowners. But for the time being, except for a few irreconcilables, France settled down to enjoy the blessings of a chastened revolution and peace. The Bourbons restored the settlement before the Vienna Congress. It was with the government of the restored Bourbons that the powers, on May 30th, 1814, signed a peace treaty. This document, the First Treaty of Paris, confined France to its pre-war boundaries of 1792. The Allied statesmen disregarded popular cries for vengeance and punishment, imposed no indemnity or reparations, and even allowed the works of art gathered from Europe during the wars to remain in Paris. It was not the desire of the victors to handicap the restored French monarchy on which they now placed their hopes. Napoleon, meanwhile, was exiled to the island of Elba on the Italian coast. To deal with other post-war questions, the powers had agreed, before signing the Alliance of Chaumont, to hold an international congress at Vienna after defeating Napoleon. Both Russia and Great Britain, however, before consenting to a general conference, specified certain matters that they would decide for themselves as not susceptible to international consideration. The Russians refused to discuss Turkey and the Balkans. They retained Bessarabia as the prize of their recent war with the Turks. They also kept Finland as an autonomous constitutional Grand Duchy, as well as certain conquests in the Caucasus, almost unknown to Europe, namely Georgia and Azerbaijan. The British refused any discussion of the freedom of the seas and also barred all questions about colonial and overseas territories. The British government simply announced which of its colonial and insular conquests it would keep and which it would return. The revolts against the Spanish Empire in Latin America were left to run their course. 808 in Europe, the British remained in possession of Malta, the Ionian Islands, and the island of Heligoland in the North Sea. In America, they kept St. Lucia, Trinidad, and Tobago in the West Indies. Of former French possessions, the British kept the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Of former Dutch territories, they kept the Cape of Good Hope and Ceylon, but returned the Netherlands Indies. During the Revolutionary and 451 Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the British had also made extensive conquests in India, bringing much of the Deccan and the Upper Ganges Valley under their rule. The British emerged in 1814 as the controlling European power in both India and the Indian Ocean. British supremacy. Indeed, of all the colonial empires founded by Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries, only the British now remained as a growing and dynamic system. The old French, Spanish, and Portuguese empires were struggling against revolutionary movements and declining to much reduced political and territorial versions of their former selves. The Dutch still held vast establishments in the East Indies, but all the intermediate positions, the Cape, Ceylon, Mauritius, Singapore, would soon be controlled by Britain. Nor, after 1814, did any people except the British have a significant navy. With Napoleon and the continental system defeated, with the Industrial Revolution bringing power machinery to the manufacturers of England, with no rival left in the contest for overseas dominion, and with a virtual monopoly of naval power, whose use they studiously kept free from international regulation, the British embarked on their century of world leadership, which may be said to have lasted from 1814 to 1914. The Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815. 800 Hymns of Vienna assembled in September 1814. Never had such a brilliant gathering been seen. All the states of Europe sent representatives, and many defunct states, and such as the formerly sovereign princes, ecclesias, and ecclesiasts of the late Holy Roman Empire, sent lobbyists to the restoration. But procedure was so arranged that all important matters were decided by the four triumphant great powers. Indeed, it was at the Congress of Vienna that the terms great and small powers entered clearly into the diplomatic vocabulary. Europe was at peace with the late enemy, but France was represented at the Congress by none other than Talleyrand, now minister to Louis XVIII. Castlereagh, Metternich, and Alexander spoke for their respective countries. Prussia was represented by Hardenberg. Although they were all aristocrats of the old regime, they by no means desired to restore the territorial boundaries of the era before the wars. They did desire, as they put it, to restore the liberties of Europe, meaning the freedom of European states from domination by a single power, and it was hoped that a proper balance of power would also produce a lasting peace. The chief menace to peace, and most likely claimant for the domination of Europe, seemed to be the late troublemaker, France. The Congress of Vienna, without much disagreement, erected a barrier of strong states along the French eastern frontier. The historic Dutch Republic, extinct since 1795, was revived as the Kingdom of the Netherlands, with the House of Orange as a hereditary monarchy. To it was added the old Austrian Netherlands, with which Austria had long been willing to part. 16 years later, this region would become the independent Kingdom of Belgium. It was hoped that the enlarged kingdom in the Netherlands would be strong enough to discourage the perennial French drive into the Low Countries. On the south, the Kingdom of Sardinia, or Piedmont, was restored and strengthened by the incorporation of Genoa. Behind the Netherlands and Piedmont, and further to discourage a renewal of French pressure on Germany and Italy, two great powers were installed. Almost all the German left bank of the Rhine was ceded to Prussia. And in Italy, again as a kind of secondary 820 barrier against France, the Austrians were firmly installed. They not only took back Tuscany and Milan, which they had held before 1796, but also annexed the extinct Republic of Venice. The Austrian Empire, now 452, included a Lombardo-Venetian kingdom in North Italy, which lasted for almost half a century. In the rest of Italy, the Congress recognized the restoration of the Pope in the Papal States and of former rulers in the smaller duchies, but it did not insist on a restoration of the Bourbons in the Kingdom of Naples. There, Napoleon's brother-in-law Murat, with support from Metternich, managed for a time to retain his throne. The Bourbon and Braganza rulers restored themselves in Spain and Portugal, respectively, and were recognized by the Congress as the reigning royal families in the Iberian states. Containing France. The Congress of Vienna combined complex diplomatic negotiations with the cultural elegance of traditional elites. This picture shows the social status of the diplomats who sought to establish peace and order in Europe after 25 years of revolution and warfare. 821, Bild Agenter Online. As for Germany, the Congress substantially confirmed the French and Napoleonic reorganization of the defunct Holy Roman Empire. The kings of Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony kept the royal crowns that Napoleon had bestowed on them. The King of England, George III, was now recognized as king, not elector, of Hanover. The German states, 39 in number, including Prussia and Austria, were joined in a loose confederation in which the members remained virtually sovereign. The Congress ignored the yearnings of German nationalists for a great unified fatherland. Metternich especially feared nationalistic agitation, and in any case, the nationalists themselves had no practical answer to concrete questions, such as the government and frontiers that a united Germany should have. 453 Germany remains divided. Finally, there was the question of Poland, which almost brought the Congress to disaster. The fall of Napoleon's Grand Duchy of Warsaw had given Alexander an opportunity to reassert his long-held plan for undoing the crime of the Polish partitions and reconstituting a Polish kingdom, with himself as the constitutional king. He sought to achieve this goal by allowing Prussia to absorb the Kingdom of Saxony, but both Metternich and Castlereagh vehemently opposed this plan. The Austrians feared the expansion of their two main rivals in Central Europe, and the British had not fought the French emperor to help the Russian Tsar extend his power over other European peoples and territories. After prolonged negotiations, the strategic interventions of Talleyrand, and the threat of a possible war among the recent allies, the contending factions reached a compromise. The Congress created a new, somewhat smaller Polish kingdom that would be remembered in history simply as Congress Poland. Alexander gave the new state a constitution and became its king, but this new kingdom, which comprised roughly the same area as Napoleon's Grand 822 Duchy, survived as a political entity for only 15 years. Prussia, for its part, received about 2/5 of Saxony, but the enduring addition of both Saxon and Rhineland territories brought the Prussian monarchy into the most economically advanced regions of Germany and to the borders of France. The net effect of the Napoleonic Wars and the peace settlement was thus to shift the center of gravity of both Russia and Prussia farther west. See maps pp. 220-21, 236-237. Congress Poland. The main political work of the Congress was completed with the agreements on Poland and Saxony, but at this point the whole settlement was unexpectedly brought into jeopardy by the reappearance of Napoleon. The 100 Days and their aftermath. Napoleon escaped from Elba, landed in France on March 8, 1815, and again proclaimed the empire. In the year since the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, discontent had been spreading in France. Louis XVIII proved to be a sensible man, but a swarm of unreasonable and vindictive émigrés had come back with him. Reaction and a white terror were raging through the country. Most adherents of the revolution, therefore, rallied to the emperor on his dramatic reappearance. Napoleon reached Paris, regained control over the government and army, and soon led an army into the southern territory of the just-established United Kingdom of the Netherlands. To the victors of the year before, and to most of Europe, it seemed that the revolution was again stirring, that the old horror of toppling thrones and recurring warfare might not, after all, be ended. The anti-French allies reassembled their troops and met Napoleon's army at Waterloo, where the Duke of Wellington led a coalition of British and Prussian forces to a great victory. Napoleon again abdicated and was again exiled, this time to distant St. Helena in the South Atlantic. A new peace treaty was made with France, the second 823 Treaty of Paris. It was more severe than the first, because the French seemed to have shown themselves incorrigible and unrepentant. The new treaty imposed minor changes on the frontiers, forced the French to pay an indemnity of 700,000 francs over 5 years, and placed a French-financed European army of occupation in northeastern France. The effect of the 100 Days, as the episode following Napoleon's return from Elba is called, was to renew the dread of revolution, war, and aggression. Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, after being almost at war with each other over Poland and Saxony 454 in January, again joined forces to get rid of the apparition from Elba, and in November 1815, they solemnly reconfirmed the Quadruple Alliance of Chaumont, adding a provision that no Bonaparte should ever govern France. They agreed also to hold future congresses to review the political situation and enforce the peace. No change was made in the arrangements agreed to at Vienna, except that Murat, who fought for Napoleon during the 100 Days, was captured and shot, and an extremely unenlightened Bourbon monarchy was restored in Naples. In addition to the Quadruple Alliance of the Great Powers, Alexander devised a vaguer scheme that he called the Holy Alliance. The Tsar proposed that all European monarchs sign a statement by which they promise to uphold Christian principles of charity and peace. All signed except the Pope, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and the Prince Regent of Great Britain. The Holy Alliance was probably sincerely meant by Alexander as a condemnation of violence. Other leaders who signed it were skeptical about mixing Christianity with politics, but it soon came to signify, in the minds of liberals, a kind of unholy alliance of monarchies against liberty and progress. Monarchical alliances, the Peace of Vienna, including generally the Treaty of Vienna itself, the treaties of Paris, and the British and colonial settlement, was the most far-reaching diplomatic agreement between the Peace of Westphalia of 824-168 and the Peace of Paris, which closed the First World War in 1919. It had its strong points and its weak ones. It produced a minimum of resentment in France, where most people were willing to accept the new arrangements. It ended almost 2 centuries of European conflicts over the control of colonial territories in Asia and the Americas. For 60 or 70 years, no colonial empire seriously challenged the British. 2 other causes of friction in the 18th century, the control of Poland and the Austro-Prussian dualism in Germany, were smoothed over for 50 years. The Vienna Treaty was not illiberal in its day. It was by no means entirely reactionary, for the Congress showed little desire to restore the state of affairs in existence before the wars. The conservative reaction that gathered strength after 1815 was not written into the treaty itself, the Peace of Vienna. But the treaty gave no satisfaction to nationalists and Democrats. It was a disappointment even to many liberals, especially in Germany. The peacemakers were in fact hostile both to nationalism and to democracy, the potent forces of the coming century. They regarded them with reason as leading to revolution and war. The problem to which they addressed themselves was to restore a more traditional balance of power, the liberties of Europe, and to make a lasting peace. In this, they were successful. They restored the European state system, a system in which a number of sovereign and independent states existed without fear of conquest or domination. And the peace they made, though some details broke down in 1830 and others in 1848, on the whole subsisted for half a century, and not for a full century, not until 1914, was there a war within Europe that lasted longer than a few months, or in which all the great powers were again involved. The Peace of Vienna thus brought to a close the great political and military upheavals that had spread across Europe in the wake of the French Revolution. Yet even the most conservative diplomats at Vienna recognized that the revolutionary events and legacy would not simply vanish from European culture or history. Indeed, the Holy Alliance and Henry XXV, the vigilance of the conservative European states after 1815, showed how deeply the French Revolution had affected all of Europe and those places outside Europe where revolutionary ideas had become popular and influential. The Latin American struggle for independence from Spain, for example, continued to draw on the new conceptions of national sovereignty 455 and continued to spread across the New World while diplomats in Vienna were working to restore stability and order in Europe. Legacy of the Revolution. 826. Europe, 1815. Boundaries show the political arrangements that emerged from the Congress of Vienna. France was reduced to the borders it had in 1789. Prussia was firmly installed on both banks of the Rhine, but South Germany remained as reorganized by Napoleon. Poland was again partitioned, with a larger share than in 1795 going to Russia, which also acquired Finland and Bessarabia. The Austrians added Venetia to what they had held before 1796. The union of the Dutch and Belgian Netherlands lasted only until 1831, when the Kingdom of Belgium was established. Otherwise, the boundaries of 1815 lasted until the Italian War of 1859, which led to the unification of Italy. 827456. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire had demonstrated how a new, more open system of social and professional advancement enabled a nation to exercise power more effectively than any of the traditional monarchical states. The revolutionary regimes had introduced new methods for mobilizing national economic resources, military forces, and large populations, all of which would reappear in the national mobilizations of other modern states. The Revolution and Napoleon, in short, gave the modern world new models of political organization and authoritarian rule. At the same time, however, the famous revolutionary events also helped to spread new conceptions of human rights, political participation, democratic government, and economic organization that would remain powerful cultural ideals throughout Europe and much of the modern world, and the popular ideology of nationalism, which developed among both supporters and opponents of the French Revolution and Napoleon, rapidly became one of the most pervasive political and cultural forces in modern world history. All of these ideas helped to produce and reshape the characteristic institutions of modern societies. They continued to attract fervent supporters after the Congress of Vienna and after all other attempts to